I'm Dr. Laura Brown. I serve as the director of the Graduate School of Political Management. It's really a pleasure to have you here and to welcome you to our day. Before we get started, the first thing I need to do is say a whole bunch of thank yous, because first, my staff has been unbelievable. They have worked tirelessly to bring this together, and I think you're going to have really just an extraordinary day. So let me just give a big round of applause. Yay, GSPM. Thank you. I also want to call your attention to all of our many sponsors. Our sponsors and partners on this conference have really been extraordinary. They have gone so far and above any call of duty you could imagine. They've helped us secure speakers. They've given us donations. They've been at meetings. They have really shown up over and over again to help make sure that this day came off flawlessly. And before we get started this morning, I just wanted to say a few words. First of all, there is a kaleidoscope on your table, and it is your swag to take with you. And why this is there is because we really wanted you to try to get out of your current frame of reference, out of the way you see the world, and to try to see things a little bit differently. I think all of us who work in the worlds of politics and communications, if you've been in it a while, you tend to get a little cynical. You tend to believe that nothing will change and that people are always going to be what people are. And what we're really trying to do with this conference is try to say, maybe it could be different. So hopefully what we will do today is spend more time talking about possible solutions or crazy ideas, kind of brainstorming how we can connect people to our democracy and how we can make the public have some sense of trust in politics and a process that is certainly designed to help them and not created to sort of make their lives worse, which I think most people believe politics does today. So I'm hopeful that you'll spend a little time peering through your kaleidoscope, imagining a different future and a different possibility, thinking about the technologies that exist as opportunities and not just things that are disrupting our lives or causing more problems. There is something, too, I wanted to just share about where we are and why we're here. There is a book that recently came out, How Democracies Die. And while I am somebody who is much more optimistic than this book, I think these comparativist political scientists miss some of the sort of rich historical tapestry that is America. And as a political scientist who is an Americanist, I can tell you that our democracy is incredibly ingenious. It innovates and power moves. One of the things that a political scientist once said to me is he said, Laura, the thing that's so fun about, political science and in the American context is that America never is, it is always becoming. And I think that that is an absolutely fascinating idea. It is something that is very true about America. The second you think you can put your finger on what's happening, I promise you it's changed. Because our politics is very porous, and ambitious candidates and many different levels of government can get engaged in the process. And that's kind of what makes it exciting. But I do agree with these professors on this one point. They said that democracies work best and survive longer where constitutions are reinforced by unwritten democratic norms. And there are two basic norms that have preserved America's checks and balances in ways we have come to take for granted. The first is mutual toleration, or the understanding that competing parties accept one another as legitimate rivals. And I think that that is very important. I say this all the time to our students, that if you're arguing for a one-party democracy, you're arguing for a dictatorship. So it's important to remember that being involved in politics means sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The other side is legitimate. You may not like what they do, but they are certainly legitimate in the field of play, which is part of the reason why we are talking about restoring sportsmanship to politics. I think professional athletes and professional sports, we just saw this at the Olympics, have a much greater sense of what it means to compete fiercely, but also respect sort of the boundaries and the rules of the game, as well as each other as athletes within it. And I think we have to learn to have some of that respect again. And the other thing that they say, the second piece, is what they call forbearance. The idea that politicians should exercise restraint in deploying their institutional prerogatives. And what they really mean by that is that even if you can go nuclear in the Senate, maybe you shouldn't. Even if you could, as Vice President Al Gore could have in 2000, acknowledged the petition from Florida and thrown out the Electoral College votes from Florida and claimed the presidency when he was in his role as President of the Senate, counting the electoral votes, he chose not to. He ceded the field to George W. Bush to become President of the United States and allowed those Electoral College votes to be counted. We can also look back to Richard Nixon actually not challenging the votes in Illinois and Texas, which he could have done, and said, no, it is the way it is. The Electoral College has spoken. John F. Kennedy will become president. So we have had many instances in our past, and Bruce Ackerman writes about this, if you want to go read some of these historical moments, where politicians have stopped short of sort of a full arms race. And what we have going on at the procedural level in Congress, at the sort of every level of our government, is this sense of, if you have the authority, use it. Use it to conquer and destroy the other side. And that has part of what has created, I think, such a problem among the American public, because the American public is very disconcerted by sort of the lack of restraint and the full-scale engagement that people are looking at politics with. Now, this doesn't mean that politics in other times have been easy. If you know anything about America, we have certainly had an unbelievable civil war. We've gone through periods of massive depression. We've also had times where our governments were far more corrupt than they are today. So this is where I would say, I hope that you approach this conference with actually a sense of, we can do better. It's more just a question of, how do we do better? And our job today as political practitioners, as former elected officials, as communications professionals, is to get out of our own sort of knowledge base and try to imagine a different future. Try to imagine the opportunities that exist in the disruption today. So with that, before we go to our panel of former professional athletes who happen to also have been former members of Congress, we have a fun sort of moment for you, a welcoming thought from one of our friends and sponsors. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Brandt, our communications director at the GSPM, and thank him for his service.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. Really appreciate you coming out and thinking about the ways in which we can transform politics. But as you all know, you can't look towards the future without understanding the past, and accordingly, we've brought some folks in here to tell us more about what they've done so that we can use them as an inspiration as we move ahead. And with that, I would like to welcome some of our most famous former presidents. Abe Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson to Teddy Roosevelt. And of course, this wouldn't be complete if presidents didn't have spokespeople. So I'll just have our spokespeople introduce themselves real fast. Speaking for President Roosevelt.
I'm Alex Tapia. I'm a student at GSPM.
Speaking for Thomas Jefferson.
Hi, I'm John McMillen. I'm a member here at GW University.
And speaking for President Lincoln.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Holman. I'm a student at GSPM as well.
All right, now, presidents, all of you are great, legendary. What is one piece of advice that you would give to today's politicians?
You cannot evade the
Honesty is the first
big
chapter in the book of
debating it
wisdom.
today.
Okay, we're going to have to take turns here. Let's start with President Jefferson.
Well, we are all Republicans, and we are all Federalists. So why don't we, with courage and confidence, create our own union, establish our own federal and Republican principle with our attachment to the union and representative government?
Oh, that's a sage point, Mr. Jefferson. But governing is about building coalitions and common ground. But campaigns are different. They're about creating divisions. So a quick show of hands, which one of you dealt with personal attacks during the campaign? Okay, everybody, right. All right. Mr. Roosevelt, let's start with you. Can you name a personal attack?
Well, Mr. Roosevelt believes that being shot was probably the most personal attack that he experienced. But that didn't stop him from finishing his speech that day or continuing a life of public service.
That's pretty personal. I can't think of much personal than that. So campaigning is tough, but no matter how hard it is, it's still worth it to govern. You all left legacies. What's the one thing you're most proud of?
Panama
Louisiana
Canal.
Purchase.
All right. Mr. Lincoln?
We would not have a nation today had President Lincoln not fought to end slavery while preserving the Union.
That's true. That's true. Great job, Mr. Lincoln. All right, so last question for you guys. Given your experiences, if you were in office today, how would you keep the Union together given our partisan divide?
Civility
I
is
think
a
it's really
virtue.
important to continue to listen to our people.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, that was less than clear, but thanks, guys. Oh, wait. We have another special guest. It's President Washington. President Washington, thanks for joining us. Do you have any advice for our participants this morning?
President Washington would like to deliver a few prepared remarks for his successors on the topic of civility and unity. He would like for us to remember the alternative domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, and itself a frightful disposition. As such, the continual mischiefs of the spirit of the party are sufficient to make it the interest of wise people to discourage and restrain it. For we know it serves to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, and foments occasionally riots and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Since there is constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion, to mitigate and assuage the spirit of the party. In short, it is a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame. Otherwise, instead of warming, it will consume.
Well said, Mr. Washington. Thank you. Now I see why we say that everyone doesn't have to look like George Washington to be George Washington. Thank you for your example. So we've tried presidents. That was not the clearest. So why don't we try some professional athletes to help us bring back sportsmanship to politics? And with that, I would like to welcome our moderator, Major Garrett, and our speakers, former Congressman Tom McMillen and Heath Shuler.
Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Before we start, I just want to say a word or two on behalf of elites. Not the elites you hear talked about these days, who are corrosive and out of touch and somehow corrupting of the American experience. I talk about people who have achieved things at an elite level because they've tried hard, set goals, and accomplished them. There is nothing wrong with that kind of elitism, in my opinion. And we are trading dangerously into a kind of hurtful ground if we always ascribe to people who achieve elite things as elitist and therefore somehow dangerous. I bring that up because Tom and Heath are elite people in two different walks of life. Both were exceptional athletes in college, both first-round draft choices in the leagues in which they tried to compete, exceptional athletes at the collegiate level. And then they became elites in American politics because they were elected and then re-elected comfortably, each for 3 terms in the United States Congress. Those are accomplishments of significant weight in American life, in any life. So I just want to say, as a way of introduction, I'm happy to be on stage with 2 elitists and 2 elite performers in American life, Tom McMillen and Heath Shuler. So let's just start with this premise. Is what you learned as an athlete and the sportsmanship and the sense of fair play and respect that you learned from a very early age and followed you through your entire athletic life applicable in politics? Is it even applicable? And then we'll have a discussion about how relevant it is, but is that a core value that can translate and should translate to politics? Heath?
Well, I think it is. Obviously, when I found myself in Washington, I started to realize pretty quickly that I sometimes agreed with the Democrats and I sometimes agreed with the Republicans, but more often I found myself agreeing with what was called the Blue Dog Coalition. And the Tuesday group was their counterparts on the Republican side. And at that point in time, I said, wow, there really is an opportunity for a real team atmosphere, because that coalition, even though it was very, very small, you could see where it could extend past just the Blue Dog Coalition, whether there was the New Dems on the Democrat side or some of the other coalitions. We could find common ground. The problem and the stigma that we seem to have always had was the leadership role that we were always fighting against, and it was a leadership on both sides of the aisle. It was the 4 or 5 members and their strong supporters are the ones that was kind of blocked every single thing that we wanted to do, even when we would say, hey, look, you have a complete coalition, not only with our group, with the Republicans, but you also have it with more Dems, and this is the direction we should go.
Fault was found with you because you weren't on the team.
I wasn't a part of the leadership team, and frankly, I was never going to be on that leadership team just because of the district of which I served and my core values.
Right, and that team concept became complicated.
That's right.
Tom?
The amazing thing about politics, the House of Representatives, and sports is the similarities. I know that sounds strange, but they're, each are based on rules. You have rules in the House, you have conventions in sport. The job of a congressman, much like being an athlete, you go into a cloakroom and you're there with folks from rural America, African American, in the country, in the cities. That's exactly like a locker room. You go in a locker room, you have to assimilate and get along, and if you don't, you're never going to be an effective legislator, certainly never an effective athlete. It's a peripatetic lifestyle. You have to deal with the media. There's pressure on you all the time. There are so many similarities between being in the House and being an athlete, and I'm sure Heath would agree with this, that what I've learned is that it was a great preparatory groundwork. And the funny thing about it, when I was there, we had Jack Kemp, we had Bill Bradley, we had Jim Bunning, we had Ben Nighthorse Campbell, we had a host of former great athletes. Today, I don't think there's a single former professional athlete in Congress, and it's a symbol of the times.
Tom, you wrote a book in 1992 called Out of Bounds, which talked about the negative effect that the sports culture was having on ethics, that there was an undercurrent of corruption, that there was a tremendous amount of greed. I don't need to tell you, it's certainly not a trenchant observation that corruption and greed have been long associated with American political life. Is there something about the sports culture that we should be hazardous or fearful of when we talk about applying everything in sportsmanship to politics?
Well, I mean, money pervasiveness in politics is a core problem. The money pervasiveness in sports is a core problem. Look at whether it's college sports or pro sports or the kind of salaries and so forth. I mean, professional sports has been corporatized today. It's lost more bonds with the average citizen.
And certainly amateur athletics have been corporatized.
Absolutely. You know, when I was a kid, I could name a whole team of baseball players. I couldn't tell you one or two players on a baseball team in this country today. And that's partly because it's all about, moving and you lose that. So, yeah, I mean, I think the money thing is very similar. So.
Now, both of you, when you talked, Tom, a moment ago about the rules, for both of you, the rules of understanding your district and communicating to your district were changed. Both of you were redistricted into a new House district, and that complicated your approach to continuing your political life in Congress, both of you. Talk to our audience about that element of American politics, and even if you are a sportsman, even if you are a team player, even if you have respect for the other side, you can still see your political livelihood altered by essentially rules outside of your control. Heath?
I think one of the things that kind of take a step back, the reason why gerrymandering happens, certainly my district is already an R+12, and it went from an R+12 to an R+14, which didn't make it that much different, but the problem was they want to make it more difficult because the biggest fear by both political parties is that moderate member, because they're able to, through what I think teamwork and teammanship, work together to bring those like-minded across the aisle. So Democrats do it to Republicans, Republicans do it to Democrats, and what we've ultimately found out now, it's no longer a race for the general election, it's a race to the primary. So what does the primary now tell you? Well, you've got to be extremist to the right or extremist to the left, and the more conservative you are, the more liberal you are, that's where you're going to have the most opportunity to gain it. And so it's almost like that. Let's have the primaries have become the real elections, and the general elections in the House, for an example, does it really matter? Because there's, maybe the last election, what was it? Maybe 25, 30 seats were truly in play. It may be a little bit different this year, but every year in and year out, it's less numbers actually are getting in play, and the gerrymandering is causing a tremendous amount of division within Congress.
And Tom, to extend the sports metaphor, it is, to take Heath's point of view, which I think is completely valid, it's as if the party leadership is picking the lineup, is trying to set the lineup. Mm-hmm. With redistricting as communicated at the state legislative level, and then as it redounds to the national level.
Well, I would say gerrymandering is one of the highest levels of rigging in politics, clearly. In my case, we had a Democratic governor. I'm a Democrat. who basically supported a Republican redistricting plan. But nevertheless, it was a rigging of really the electoral process, which I've always felt that we should take lessons from the Brits who do it, you know, in a much more independent, balanced way than having legislatures in the politics do it. But I've seen rigging in sports too, believe me. I was on the '72 Olympic game, a basketball game that was probably the most, you know, scandalous Olympic game of all time, where we won the game against the Soviets. An official came in and kept resetting the clock, and finally on the third time, the Soviets won, and they took the gold, and we refused to accept the silver. So, I mean, believe me, in my life, I've been kind of in the rigged process on both sports and politics.
Let me ask you just kind of a fun question. What is more, in your life, more thrilling, winning a big game or winning a congressional seat?
A big game. But that was my childhood dream. I mean, so it kind of really goes back to when I was in the 5th grade. I said, I'm going to play in the NFL. I mean, I went to my parents and said, I'm going to do this. I'm playing in the NFL. And I didn't, in the 5th grade, I'd go to my parents and say, I want to be a member of Congress. So winning that big game was great. I think I was involved in politics for a much different reason, because I did take my 20s and I was playing professionally, that I did not serve my country. So I took it more or less that how do I serve my country at the highest level I can possibly serve? And it was more of how I felt that was my responsibility of all the great things the country and the state and my community had given to me. I need to give back. So I know that may sound a little cliche, but it had nothing to do with politics. Matter of fact, I got hit all the time because I didn't vote often. You know, I couldn't have told you who was my member of Congress at, you know, maybe 2 years prior to me running. I really didn't know, but I ultimately decided I need to serve my country. And, you know, I was all broken up from playing the game of football, and I was too old to get in the military. So, you know, that was my choice.
Tom?
My penultimate moment was not in sports or in politics. It was winning a Rhodes Scholarship. That was my penultimate moment. When I was running for Congress, I was running while I was in the NBA. No one's ever done that before. I announced for Congress, played a whole season in the NBA as a candidate for Congress. On election night, Dan Rather, your network, said I was going to lose. We were down by like 10,000 votes. And in the next hour, the African American communities came in, and make a long story short, it wasn't decided for weeks afterwards, but I won by 400 and some votes. And although that was a tremendous fulfilling thing, I still go back to, you know, we love the great wins. Those are things we never forget. But my ultimate moment was winning the Rhodes.
When you came to Congress, having the profile that you achieved in athletics, did that in any way open doors for you or pave things in a way that members who were not as well known and perhaps not as lionized because of their athletic career didn't have?
There's no question. I had quite an interesting class. We had Nancy Pelosi was in our class, Dennis Hastert, 2 speakers, Fred Grandy, you know, the Love Boat. We had Joe Kennedy. We had Jim Bunning. We had quite a illustrious class. I ended up being class president in my second year, but there's no question being an athlete helps. It opens the door. When I ran, it was the way we could get crowds to come. But if you didn't have anything to say, they weren't going to vote for you. So it was the greatest asset and your greatest liability at the same time.
Did you find that to be true, Heath, that you could draw a crowd, but you still had to bring your political A game?
Yeah, there was actually, when we did our very first poll, I was humbled pretty quickly. I thought my name ID would be much higher than it was. And I was like, oh my goodness, these people, no one knows who I am. But they didn't know me from a political side the reference was politics, but when it was the sports side, they knew. But when I came to Washington, it was kind of the icebreaker. It was everyone can talk about sports, and you can have a conversation about it. So it was really easy to go and with my colleagues that being a freshman member, we could talk about sports, and they were so intrigued about, well, tell me how it was to play in the NFL. Tell me what it was in college. those were such icebreakers that you ultimately was a gateway for developing a relationship.
Just as a follow-up real quick on that, you know, the most important caucus I belonged to in the United States Congress was the 3 o'clock caucus, sometimes called the wet head caucus. You know what that caucus was? Republicans and Democrats went down to the House gym and played basketball every afternoon. They don't do that anymore today, and I don't know if they did it when you were there, but that was the place that I got to know the Republicans better than any other place in the Congress.
And Tom, I think the problem is because they're not in Washington any longer.
Yeah.
Since when the New Deal, when Newt came in, you know, members of Congress before that, prior, was living in Washington, D.C. And then they would go back home, but their families were here. They were raising their kids here. You know, their spouses would communicate together. You know, they were working a 5-day work week. So not only were they able to have oversight, which we ultimately don't have now in Congress. There's no oversight of legislation that was passed many years ago to see how it relates to business today. There is no oversight. It's all about, hey, what is the next bill that you can pass? And then now with the blockade, you're not getting either of those done because they come up on Tuesday, go home on Thursday. I was guilty of that. I wanted to be the last one here. I always called them bed check votes. It was those Tuesday night votes I had at 7 o'clock, and it was to rename a post office in Wichita, Kansas. I didn't care about that post office in Wichita, Kansas, just to check a mark for a member of Congress, you know? It was about, you know, what are we going to do that's really of substance? And these members don't know one another. And then unfortunately, I mean, we had this conversation earlier, it was like members knew one another. They, you know, they don't have animosity toward one another. Like right now, they're trying to stand on the House floor and see who's going to win the next Emmy, right? That's more important than developing that relationship. And Tom and I are of two different parties, and our spouses are our friends, and our kids go to school together. It's really hard for me to stand up and say anything derogatory or negative about Tom's policy. But more than likely, we can actually go to the back room and say, hey, how can we work this out? Here's a problem I have. Are you willing to negotiate? Yes, yes, yes. Works out. We both go to leadership, and it ultimately should have been done. That would happen if they lived in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
and it sounds horrible, and people back home wouldn't realize that, but they need to live in Washington, D.C. and spend 3 weeks up here and 1 week back home to understand it's the world today. Communication is great. It's easy. But live in Washington, D.C.
I agree with that. You know, Jerry Ford used to say that the jet airplane was the demise of Congress because Dan Rostenkowski and Bob Michael used to drive to Illinois. Silvio Conte and Tip O'Neill used to drive up to Boston. And, you know, I'd go so far as to give them, like all state legislators, a per diem so they don't have to sleep in their office. Their wife can come here and live. The idea that you make these people go back and forth like yo-yos and they never get to know each other is just, it's so destructive to the system.
And taking those nostalgic notes seriously, there is another dimension to this. I mean, when both parties run relentlessly, as they have for 20 or 25 years against Washington, and demonize people who have a house in Washington by taking a picture of it and saying, look at where candidate or Congressman or Congresswoman X lives. That's part of this process. You can't decouple that from this reality, can you?
But you can, because what we're saying is the peripatetic nature of coming in here for 2 days. You know, come in here for a full week, have a little longer period of time. You can still have to go back to your district. There's no question of that. And yes, that'll be a campaign.
But I mean, the consultantocracy that has run against Washington as an institution, and anyone who's in it, once you arrive here, then you're part of it.
Right. We're all guilty of it. I mean, I ran against Washington when I was a candidate.
Right.
And, you know, the next candidate who ran against me being in Washington. I mean, it was 2 years later, I was a part of the establishment. You know, so
even though you didn't feel like it.
Even though I didn't feel it. I mean, I got beat up on both sides of the aisle for living in a bipartisan house. I lived in what was called the C Street house. Oh, did Rachel Maddow ever kill me on the news, right? I mean, it was every single night there was a segment about it. And it was a great place. Yes, did I live with Republicans? Yes. Did that make me a bad person? No. That made me a better member of Congress.
And when you think about, I started covering Congress in 1990. Back then, the committee system was a much more structurally important part of the process, whether it was appropriations, authorization. And now, quite apart from the sportsmanship metaphor and application, leadership writes most of the most important legislation. Committees are disempowered. They may be consulted, they may have conversations on the side, but the visibility and the teamwork at the committee level, if you will, has been diminished by the control exercised by leadership. Does that make this entire concept of sportsmanship, team building, all the more difficult? I think the question kind of answers itself, but I'd like your perspective on it.
Obviously, members today think that the Congress operates on CR, closing the government down, and zero regular order. And by the way, that's not how it worked for hundreds of years. We always had regular order. I mean, that's made your committees viable.
And when you talk about regular orders, make sure they understand.
That, you know, a bill starts, it's introduced by a member, it's referred to a committee, the committee processes the legislation, you know, then it goes, if it passes the committee, you know, then it goes to the Rules Committee and then to the floor. That's regular order process. That is not mandated by the Speaker or the Majority Leader. That is actually a process where the committee chairs are pushing and moving stuff through. Right now, so much is top down. That as a member of Congress, I mean, you have zero influence on legislation. About the only thing you can do is constituent service, which is really, you do get a lot of satisfaction out of that. But the job is like a tenth of what it used to be in terms of really making a meaningful contribution. And the rank and file are really disgusted with it because they come here thinking they can make a difference and they throw their hands up. John Runyon, another former athlete, just said, I'm out of here. This place is crazy, right? Yeah.
And if you're taking to this conversation the idea of team building, it's hard to build a team at the committee level if you've got nothing to do, if you've got no game to play.
Yeah, I mean, typically you're doing it to, you know, help a constituent. And I want to have a committee, you have a hearing, and you can go talk about it back home. And typically, sometimes if leadership doesn't like your issue, you have to go do it back home separately. And you hold a, quote, off the hill hearing, and you get the satisfaction of your constituents, but ultimately it's very difficult to get anything done. Although I do relate it to sports. Mike Ditka was my head coach, so it was a dictatorship. Very much like Congress is a dictatorship with the leadership. I mean, it was either the leadership's way or no way, or it's Mike Ditka's way or no way. So I kind of related to that at the end of the day with Mike Ditka.
And by the way, Bill Galston came out with a great idea, which, you know, we elect the speaker in one party. Let's change that rule. Let's go elect the speaker with the whole Congress. Make the leadership be connected to the whole body. That's number one. That would be, I think, an important reform. Number two, if I could make the rules, I would make every freshman congressman go on a Codell, on a big bipartisan Codell. Yeah, you'll be criticized back in your district, but send it somewhere worthwhile. Go to the Middle East, but go with a bunch of your members of the other party, right? And I think that would help build relationships.
So let me continue with this metaphor of team building, because there are times in sports when a team is in crisis. So much so that the team tells the coach, leave. Tells the assistant coaches, leave. Because we're going to have a team meeting. Because we have a big problem and we need to solve it among ourselves. So let me just ask this as a theoretical question. Could that ever be possible for this institutional problem of leadership outstripping the power of committees? Could the team members say, hey, we're not accepting that anymore. We want the coaches out of the room, and the cloakroom is going to be for us on the committee or the committees to say, no, we're pushing back on that because it's not helpful for the institution, it's not helpful for the process. And if you keep doing it, you can't rely on our votes. Is that even theoretically possible? Or is that just like an academic exercise that we're going to indulge in here for the morning amid our scrambled eggs?
I tried that a little bit.
Okay.
Against Pelosi for speaker.
Right.
Only got 63 votes. all of my guys that would have voted for me got beat in that 2010 election.
The next one.
Yeah, 2010 election, so I had no votes, right? But I think the most difficult part of that is identifying the makeup of members of Congress. And I think there's 3 makeups of members of Congress. And if someone gets mad, it's because they probably fall into one of these categories, what I'm about to say, that they may not like. I think there's a third members of Congress are there for all the right reasons. And I think Tom and I were there for the right reasons, to help grow, and it was about our country, not about our political party. I think that's a third of the members of Congress. So if they were all like that third of the members of Congress, you could absolutely get
Have that
done.
team meeting, right?
Yes, you could have that team meeting. The problem is you got another 2/3. That other one other thirds is they're for power, greed, of holding that position. I mean, narcissism would fall into that category, okay? Then there's another third. It's the only job they could ever hold down. I mean, you know, being in the private sector now, there's a third I would never hire. Because what could they do for me in my business? All right? They started out in local politics, and now they're members of Congress, now they're senators. You know, so what have they done to really? So if we had a third of those that were there for all the right reasons, and don't get me wrong, I think there's people that are there that are in that latter category of it's the only job they get. I think they're there for all the right reasons. I'm just saying they have to have the job, so they're not willing to go out and make a stance like that because they have to protect their job. They have to protect their livelihood. I've always said this, if the members of Congress would do all the right things, both the Senate and the House would do everything correctly this year and quit worrying about whether they get reelected, they would never, not a one of them would get reelected if they did all the right things. But 10 years from now, as a society, we would look back and say that was the greatest Congress to have ever served. Now, that's the type of members that we need in Washington.
What I would say, I wish Teddy Roosevelt would come back in here and tell us how important it was when he passed legislation that was undone by Citizens United, because members of Congress spend so much time raising money. So that you asked the question, Major. The money entrenchment makes it very hard to overturn the powers to be in the Congress, because here's what happens. It didn't happen when I was there. So if you have a district like Heath and I had, tough districts, but we didn't worry about someone coming in spending $10 million on us overnight in the last minute of a race, unless they were fabulously wealthy. We knew that if we did a good job and raised enough money, we were secure, with the exception of gerrymandering, but we were secure. Today, you know, you're so dependent because that $10 million check can come in at the end of the race. And that's personally why I would never run for Congress again. I wouldn't want, because there's like he said, there's several kinds of districts. There's one district where you're so safe that you run to your corner on everything. So I'm going to run over to the left corner, run over to the right corner. Or there are other districts that are fewer and fewer now that are tough districts like Heath and I did, where you have to worry about money all the time. And that's just not the way our country should run. So I think it'd be hard to overturn those money interests.
Got it.
Percentage of time that members really are in Washington, remember I talked about they're here up on Tuesday night, home on Thursday. The time at which they're here, they're spending half of that money at fundraisers or raising money on the phone.
So now the best part of the presentation, your questions. So we'll throw the floor open. There will be microphones circulating, I am told. So if anyone has a question for these two elitists, as I said before, please bring your questions on, and we'll have them take them in order.
Question? Anyone have a question?
Oh, Frank Fahrenkopf has a question.
Frank, don't make it too hard on us.
I was really interested in this concept of not knowing each other. Do you think the limitation of codels, and also, not exactly the same, the elimination of earmarks has had a negative impact on how the Congress acts?
So quickly, CODELs, congressional delegations, flights to some place, lots of members would go on. When I started first covering Congress in 1990, they became topical, became kind of a negative. Wasting taxpayer money, going off on junkets, shopping sprees, et cetera. And some of that did actually happen, and there's been a tremendous pullback from just any and all congressional delegations and those kinds of trips. So just as a predicate to sort of
yes,
lay that.
and yes and yes. When I was a freshman congressman, I got on the shuttle, and Richard Nixon was on the shuttle with me, and he was giving me advice for an hour. He said, "Let me tell you, Tom, what you need to do is travel and see the world. It's the most important thing you can do." And I did. I tried to go to places like Afghanistan and so forth, but believe me, that became a campaign ad against me. So I think it should be institutionalized more. And the second thing, earmarks, yes, of course, that's the glue that kept Congress together, and we, in the name of reform, just splintered it further. So yes and yes to both of them.
And Heath, you were in Congress when earmarks were a very big issue.
Yeah, so I was there when we had earmarks and then when we didn't have earmarks. And when I ultimately found out rural America is being devastated based upon not having earmarks because there's no way to bring any money back. So, let's just be realistic. The major cities in America, they have the people in the know that can go lobby the administration. Now, who has the purse strings? The administration does. So now they get to reward all the money and the checks. And rural America has no opportunity now to, help with the schools, help with the roads that need to be built. And you're going to start seeing less and less. I mean, the infrastructure in America is being, is crumbling now. And I think so much of that's based upon the earmark process that we don't have in. I mean, I have to look at all the earmarks that I have. Most all of them are infrastructure needs, and we don't have that anymore. And not to mention the continuity. I mean, Obie wasn't a Blue Dog fan, right? I mean, Chairman Obie wasn't.
David Obie, Appropriations Committee Chairman.
He wasn't the biggest Blue Dog fan, but at least it was, currency. The currency. I mean, I'm not saying that you ever voted for a legislation because of it, but you
It was part of the conversation.
Part of the conversation, you kind of thought, wow, I see.
That's the tokens of politics, right?
Right. And when Tom DeLay, who was the majority leader, really sold the idea of earmarks institutionally to his fellow Republicans, some of whom were originally skeptical, he said, look, two things. One, it's a way to give members of Congress more control by almost line item control over the spending, taking it out of the bureaucracy, point one. Point two, is also a way to create coalitions when we need to create them. Interesting story about that. So one time there was a vote that was hanging fire, it was very close. Tom DeLay had an office just off the Speaker's lobby. Members were filing in and coming out, and of course reporters like myself were there waiting to find out what they were going to do, change their vote, yes or no, and a member came out, I can't remember who it was, and I said, so did you get anything? He goes, yeah, got 2 bridges. I said, you gonna vote yes? He goes, no, ain't got no rivers. It's a classic earmark story, ladies and gentlemen. It's a classic earmark story. Next question, please.
Thank you so much. I was curious to know if you feel as though social media has contributed to the divisiveness in politics today, and if you have any experiences reflecting on it from your prior experience too.
Yeah, well, how does sportsmanship and social media, how do they relate, or how are they arch enemies?
I'm gonna let Tom answer that question.
Well, the funny thing is, in the 80s and 90s, CNN was just started, Fox wasn't there. I was telling Major, the fairness doctrine, we lost that in the Reagan administration. That caused the Fox to be emerged. So you have this accentuation of going to the corners, which is Fox and MSNBC, and then social media just amplifies it. It's an amplification of really what is already happening in the body politic, which are people are running to their corners. We're just turning the volume up. That's what all that is. So.
And to that point, Tom, and this goes back to this underlying metaphor, teams and the team orientation. I have been struck in the last 20 years about how much politics feels like it's become a team sport, like it's a jersey-wearing sport.
It's a contact sport.
And well, it always has been a contact sport, but the idea that I have this sort of bloodthirsty antagonism toward the other team because they're wearing a different jersey is in the way I would have for my favorite team against our arch rival. Do you feel that?
And I think what this also does is, I think in politics, especially in the primaries, it's kind of that, what I would say, the fringe group that actually is, going to the polls, it's the fringe group that's doing all the work, right? So even if, regardless of which party, you got 20% of that party that's doing, it's the old 80-20, 20% is doing 80% of the work. That's the one that's going to the polls. That's the ones that are working. That's the same people are on the same social media, that they are, quote, that is the team. And sometimes that team opposes you. I mean, I knew going into the general election I was going to win substantially, but I was kind of worried about the primary because they, quote, that fringe group was going to send me a message, and boy, did they ever. I lost my biggest county to almost a write-in candidate. I mean, lost the biggest county, and I was like, wow, these people, they mean business, I want to play them that song, How Do You Like Me Now, to that group, but, they created a team, and I was the opposition. I was the opponent, even though we were supposed to be in the same conference at least.
Right.
We weren't on the same team.
Next question.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question back, referring to the part where you talked about more congressmen reviewing and kind of giving oversight to some of the laws that previous Congresses have passed and seeing how effective or not effective. And in light of that, do you think that the way that, I know specifically within the Republican committee system, you're seeing a lot of the more senior members, once they get to that committee chairmanship, then they're retiring because of committee term limits. Do you think that that kind of structure is actually hurting us? And kind of in that vein, is that institutional knowledge, do you think that has something to lack of, has something to do with kind of a breaking down of Congress?
That's an excellent question.
It's an excellent question. I would say first of all, the Congress has historically done a very bad job in oversight. So, they pass a bill and then they don't look at what they did. And that's been ongoing for a long time. I think it's exacerbated now because the oversight committees have become very political. They've become more a political tool than a real investigatory tool. And the other thing is, you're right, the turnover in Congress, there's less of that institutional memory. So what happens then is the bureaucracy becomes stronger. So the congressman is the buttress, the congresswoman is the buttress against a strong bureaucracy. The irony of term limits is that if you don't have someone there 20 years who understands the system, you've just made that person at Health and Human Services sitting in an office much stronger. They say, that congressman will be gone, I'll get the next one. So I do think our system, the job is now very unpleasant. You take it, if you're going to the grocery store, they'll take your photo and say, you're not feeding your child organic food. Your life is no longer your own. It's a terrible thing. So I think it's permeated a lack of oversight, independent oversight, and all the things that you just raised. So.
And it's an excellent question because I was covering Congress at the time Republicans decided to term limit their chairman. And the idea was, well, we're going to get rid of this idea that chairman can hold the gavel for 20 years and have complete and unchecked dominion over the legislative agenda of that committee in perpetuity. And if a piece of legislation is honorably introduced, they can take it and stuff it in the drawer and it never sees the light of day again. And if that committee chairman is no term limiting on him or herself, that never changes, and there's nothing leadership can do about it. So it was an idea of empowering leadership by having this rotating committee structure at the chairman level. And many people thought, even institutionalists I talked to at the time said it might be a really good idea, not anticipating some of the underlying problems. One, chairmen are really active for about 3 years, and then they know they're being term limited, so they start vying with leadership to get on the next committee to be the next chairman. The fundraising trajectory changes for them dramatically once they become chairman, and then as they begin to be termed out, it begins to slacken off, again incentivizing them to look for the next committee to be a chair of. And it's created other incentive structures that really nobody anticipated that are maybe as negative. Certainly, they have their own negative realities to them in the way that the other structure did too. And this goes to your point, Heath, about members doing the right thing. You can't rule right your way out of behavior. Behavior is. You can have rules that are guardrails, but you can't rule right your way out of behavior. And do you have any comments on this idea of rotating committee chairmanships and what it's done institutionally to the flow or the structure of the Congress?
I mean, rotating it seems, obviously, that would make the most sense, right? I mean, kind of the outside looking in would seem to make the most sense. I think there was two parts to it. One is at what point in time does that chairman, he or she, become incapable of performing the work and the duties? And I think that we saw that a lot of times on the Democrat side, that they had been there for so long that they lost their ability to perform at such a high level. At that point in time, someone's got to go put their arm around them and say, hey, I think it's time to step down.
Right.
And unfortunately, that doesn't happen.
And without term limits, you can't even have that.
You can't really have that.
Right.
So, I mean,
That was another impetus, just to take members who had been chairman for a long time and ease them out. And just have this knowledge that there's this rotating process.
And I think what that also did, and I'm more of an advocate of, go spend 6 to 12 years and be done, right, in Congress. Rotate it out a little bit. Go spend that time and be done, and let someone else take over, get a fresh view, a fresh look at it from your community. But what was happening in that perspective, members started staying longer because they think, is the chairman going to step down? I'm next.
Right.
I'm next. And so you looked at the top dais and what was happening. I mean, it was the age of the members were like, 75, 80 years old, 82 years old, and they were all waiting to see when the chairman was going to step down because they wanted their time as the chair. And you look at it, by the time it was there, to be honest with you, typically their ability to function at a highest level they possibly could was gone.
Next question. Yes, sir.
So I'm struck by a number of points, your comments about changes that have been made over the past 30 years. Many of them are driven by an increased populism and attack on politics. So my question is, can you name one thing that we could do that would try to restore the integrity of politics? And I'm thinking against that populist thing, we have this report here about the American public lusting for civility. And I wonder how we can encourage more discussion about the need for civility and less discussion about how terrible politics and politics.
And it's a really fascinating thing to watch, people lusting for civility. It's amazing, to behold that. It really is.
I think Tom and I both were probably in the same thing. If we would do away with gerrymandered districts, we would no longer have the parties controlling the members of Congress. So for an example, we would ultimately, if gerrymandering did not exist, and John Tanner had a piece of legislation, and we had 0 non-blue dogs, endorse the policy, and essentially what it was is like a lottery system, that non-state members, so North Carolina, for an example, my home state, would have, the Democrats would pick 2 people, the Republicans would pick 2 people in the state legislature, and then collectively they would come up with a 5th person. Every state would do that. And then each state would be put into a lottery, and then they would then help draw the lines for other states where you took the politics out of it, but you still had enough people politically in mind that they would understand how to make the process work. I think if you take the gerrymandered lines out, you will then get back to what I would consider more of a 50-50 voting pattern. I think it would solve a couple things. One is you wouldn't have the elections just become the primary elections, but you would actually have more turnover over time. I think, more 50-50 voting patterns, if you don't do the right thing for the American people in your community, then you're going to have more turnover. And honestly, I think Washington needs more turnover.
But Heath, you've got to acknowledge, you're never going to take the politics out of drawing lines of districts. You're just never going to. And as I mentioned a moment ago, you can't rule right your way out of behavior. Yeah. Political animals are going to be political animals. Yeah. You can create buffering systems. California has a commission now that supervises its methodologies. Courts are now stepping in. The Supreme Court has always had a historic hands-off approach to this. This is a Congress. This is not something we're going to deal with at the federal judicial level. But you cannot argue to yourself or to the country that you can take politics out of the drawing of district lines. You can create buffering mechanisms, and I think that's a more lively topic now than it was 20 years ago, because I think people have seen some of the effects of these tight lines that create a self-reinforcing partisanship that is more primary focused than general election focused. Tom?
That's a great question, and certainly gerrymandering is a problem, but listen, gerrymandering's been going on and on.
Yeah, we accomplish a lot of great things in this country with gerrymandered districts.
I wouldn't necessarily point to that. I do believe the money in politics is divisive and corrosive, and I don't know when in our lifetimes we're going to see a change in that. But here's the one that bothers me the most, okay? The one that bothers me the most is that I think this is true of Congress, but our students as well, our kids, we don't know history in this country, and I think that if you do not know history, you're doomed to repeat it. I bet you could ask members of Congress how many people died in World War II, and very few would be able to answer 50 million people died. And that I don't think members of Congress, I certainly don't think our president, I think our kids, we don't understand history, and don't think that this democracy will survive unless we understand the mistakes that we've made in the past. So personally, I think we have a much more civic education to do as a country. That's my number one. So,
Tom, we'll give you the last word. Thank you very much for your attendance and your great questions, and thanks very much to Tom and Heath Shuler, and it's been a pleasure. Have a great day. Thanks very much.